polarization, and the society that breaks a network of possible union and reconciliation is to say that this House regrets the rise of Callout culture. We have three arguments for you in today's proposition bench. One, we'll talk about cultural divide. Two, on the trial by humiliation. And finally, by our second speaker, a permanent past. Before this, on what do we stand on today's proposition? We say that Callout culture is the digging up of all the recent videos, tweets, statements made by people. And this is generally done with social media in a shameful and humiliating manner. We do, however, still in the proposition support things like legal mechanisms in which victims are helped and people that violate the law are punished. This includes things like sexual harassment or hate speech. Furthermore, on the proposition, what we'll tell you today is that we stand for people learning through conversation, not with humiliation. And by the end of today on the proposition, what you will hear is that we help betters those that have been offended on the past. But now, on the first argument, and that is the cultural divide. Here's where we say that Callout culture further divides society and limits the social progress and cohesion that we can have. The first question that we bring up today's debate is, why do people generally make offenses on the first place? And we think that first, we find a group of people that are misinformed. Those are people that come from backgrounds, families, in which they lack information as to understanding why is it problematic to be offensive and not being as respectful as they could be. No thanks. And here what we say is that when we shame people on this kind of culture, we only humiliate them, but without making them understand what is it that they are doing wrong. And beyond just individuals, what we see is for the rest of society, people that share similar thoughts to those that were the offenders. They see how this one person is being humiliated, but yet not learning what is it that was done wrong. And what we think is that what this then forces the rest of people that have this kind of thoughts to keep on having those thoughts, that kind of misinformation, but rather remain silent and remain on the private level. We think this is probably the reason why you find many professors from the United States that hold conservative views and yet they're unwilling to share with the public because they know that they'll be humiliated by the rest of the peers if they do so. What happens here is that because people remain silent about the way they think, the thank you is that people never change because they are never exposed to a different way of thinking simply because they know that if they share what they think, the answer will be humiliation. But the second group of people that we talk about here, and those are people that currently feel alienated in our kind of system, and that is people that see the left as an extreme elite that literally does not care about them, or at least that is a characterization that they get from this group of people. Probably that is the reason why over 50% of the United States white supremacists feel that they're the most excluded group in society. You see, they feel that the ones that are being discriminated against. But what happens with Callout culture? What we find is that we make them feel even more alienated because they suddenly get a whole mob that is pushing them and saying, you're wrong and you should be punished. Sure.
Are you saying that white supremacists should never be told that they are wrong?
Absolutely not. What we are saying is that they should be told that they are wrong, but in different manners. Here's what we talk about, why conversation matters, and why the way we change people's mind matters. I mean, at the moment that we tell people that they are wrong, but at the same time we're sending hate messages or humiliating them horribly, thinking this by the millions on social media, that is how we not change minds, but rather how we push people more into the corner as to having this kind of wrongful and offensive ideas. But the second thing that we say is that the rest of the people, thank you, those that hold kind of similar ideas are made to empathize with those that were the original offenders. Because when you see one video of, let's say, an African American woman that was being mistreated by a white man, but then there's some kind of reaction against this white man, you see the rest of the people are going to see this one that was the original offender as someone that is being humiliated, the one that is kind of weak in the society. And this is what creates empathy to those that were the original offenders. What we get here in society is that we antagonize those that were the original victims, and we create empathy for those that are the actual offenders. They rather see those who are victims and the people reacting as the over-exaggeration, but they generalize that for every single person that is a victim and generalize this as a good people for those that are passing on the line. More importantly, here's what we say, that this pushes people to be radical, and that is both on an individual level, on the everyday life, and even in a private manner, silent manner, but still more radical and more exclusionary, and also to support, let's say, things like far-right movements. And rather, our alternative here, the one thing that we say is that we rather support things like discourse and conversation, because we think that is the only way to change the mind of others, the things. Because at that point is where we acknowledge that every single person is a human. If we humiliate them, we cannot kind of have those kinds of conversations. But the second thing that comes from this argument, and there is where we talk about, we also have in-group fighting. So the kind of culture that we have is not always, let's say, someone from the left calling out an extremist, but many times even people within this liberal groups. We take example of a woman that was the only forefront woman on a rock metal band in Montana. Now, there was a video where she was accused of calling another woman on high school a swab. And for that reason, she was kicked out of the community and also called an anti-feminist. You see, the problem is that this woman was also at the same time looking for more legal action as to things like harassment on the circle where she was. And although she was looking for change, and she was just simply kicked out for one statement that she made on the past. You see, this ended up being counterproductive because we push out sometimes people off groups that when they could be working together to have mutual change. Having said this, let us move on to our second argument. And here we talk about the trial by humiliation. Here we say that we delegitimize justice and give power to mob mentalities when we use culture. In principle, we think that vengeance and humiliation are not the means to achieve justice. We think that justice should look as to looking for the truth, rehabilitation, and appropriate retribution. Let me tell you why this doesn't happen on the side of the house. No thanks. One thing that we say is that we're not allowing victims to have justice, because many times you have victims that don't want the private information to go out, because someone is calling out their offenders, but yet at the same time they want their own information to remain private. We take the example of a woman that was groped by a member of the Pine Rock Band. She didn't want anyone else to know that this happened. Her friend knew about this and then made it public. And then Callout culture comes on next. But you see, the kind of punishment that this woman was looking for was not for her aggressor to be exposed on social media and be attacked. She wanted to keep on this private. And we think that as long as the victim wants this is far more important. And Callout culture does not allow for this basic respect for the victims. We furthermore think that this pressure victims as to doing so. You see, justice is not being fulfilled as long as what the victims' hearts are not being even upheld. But the second thing, we talk about defenders, and here's where we say that we need a justice system and not a mob mentality. Mainly because when we have this kind of culture, people work like a bandwagon, and they reach conclusions without necessarily even being right about those. And we think this even amplifies, like the same culture that works for some kind of offenses is amplified for some that are even far worse. So for example, when someone says a bad word, it is treated as badly as some kind of sexual harassment. Thing is, in this argument, that social media is not and will never have the sufficient checks and balances that we need for justice in our society. And this means that we both hurt the victims and we also hurt the offenders in an unproportionate way. Judges, culture is only dividing more society, polarizing it. Don't vote for it.
Callout culture exactly look like? Because they seem to nitpick and cherry pick a lot of examples. They look like the Me Too movement that called out for sexist men in power. It looks like Drake was accused of severely criticized for insulting racial minorities by painting himself in black on his album cover. It looks like the movement of Oscars So White that called out white domination in Oscars at the end of the day. We think that all these were the channel in which helped minorities to speak out in our society. And microaggression and structural discrimination have existed for decades, and callout culture was what finally started the change we are so proud to oppose. Before I go into our rebuttals and our constructive, let's clarify what our stance is. We think we stand by the side that callout culture enabled protection for minorities that legal processes failed to address for a very long time. The metric of this debate has to be who creates a safer society for minorities to speak out, and that's exactly what we're going to prove on our side of today. So before I go on and explain how constructive on first, why we structurally empower minorities, no thank you. The second on why it becomes easier for minorities to reach out to legal platforms as well, let me move on to several rebuttals. The first thing that they talk about is that, you create this cultural division and it hurts cohesion because, conversation matters. The first response that we have is that calling out is precisely telling that these ignorant people that they seem to agree that your remarks were sexist, your remarks were racist. Under their world, they're going to continue to be ignorant. Why is that the case? We already think that people are already educated that sexism is bad, racism is bad. The problem is they don't know that their individual behavior is sexist or their individual behavior is racist. Calling out is precisely what tells them that your behavior was racist, your behavior was sexist. We don't understand why under their world they gained this epiphany suddenly. But secondly, yes, conversation matters and we agree with that. But they don't tell us why conversation is exclusive under their side of the house. We also think that conversation can happen under our side as well. What we rather think is that this call-out culture is ultimately what triggers the conversation between minorities and majorities. No, thank you. But thirdly, they tell you that white people are isolated. Okay, seriously, white people are not isolated in the status quo. They are a majority and that's already a given. If there are white supremacists that believe that, white people are isolated, we think that these people already exist on both sides of the house. We don't think that these people should be a reason for us to oppose to these calling out cultures of minorities. But fourth of all, they talk about false accusations and harms inflicted on these people. We think that that is the case when they cherry pick minorities of cases. We tell you that we're going to talk about why in the majority of cases we actually empower minorities and why that is comparatively better. But fifthly, even if we take them at their best, we think that our principle is more important. So even if we have some backlash, even if we have some people who disagree, we still think that the cause of protecting minority is bigger and more important. Just because when Martin Luther King fought for black people's rights, white people were angry, doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight for black people's rights. That is the side that we stand by. And then the second argument is about why, this trial of humiliation. So you're gonna, if you go to trial, you're gonna be exposed to public, so you're not going to be incentivized to go to trial. That's basically the logic that they have chosen. If you don't want to be seen, then you can just go to trial. You don't necessarily have to call out every single time under our side of the house. We give them the choice for people to whether or not they want to call out or not. They're the side that bars people structurally from speaking out against majorities. Before I go on to a constructive, yes.
What is the point in calling out someone if no change is made?
No, we think that we're just going to prove to you in my constructive why change actually happens. First, structural empowerment of minorities. The first analysis is that power imbalance between minorities and majorities exists. That is to say that regardless of legal measures, societal structure of discrimination has persisted for decades. We're not talking about rape or sexual harassment that's going to trial here. We're talking about things like microaggression, like workplace harassment against women, or racial remarks on minorities that you face in daily manners. This structure is very difficult to change because of this power imbalance already exists. It's very difficult for a minority to voice out as a minority when everyone surrounding you is a part of the majority group. This is not because these people are all intentionally sexist, but often because they're ignorant of the fact that they're being sexist. Crucially, because they were fine living that way for a very long time, the culture has persisted. And that is why these people are often ignorant to the fact that this culture is sexist or racist or discriminatory towards any group of minority groups. The second analysis, how did call-out culture enable that structural reform to happen? We think that we are the side that created a counterbalance to that majority power and power imbalance that already existed. How? We think that opposite people who are called out are people in power, people who are in the majority group previously, who are holding the power against minority group. We think that largely had two impacts. A, that impacted the person who was called out. Not only were they shamed by community and actively told by society, the society has changed and they're no longer able to tolerate such behaviors and ideologies. That's not okay for you to do. We think that that's a direct call against their ignorance. Unlike what they also concede is that these people are ignorant. Our side is the one that tells them that they're doing something wrong. But this also crucially can also result in actual consequences as well. We give you examples of, for example, the Papa John's CEO was literally kicked out of his own company because he was racist and because he kept on making racial slurs to everyone in his company. Harvey Weinstein was kicked out of Hollywood because he was accused of sexual harassment. Alabama senator in Alabama election, a senator dropped out of election precisely because he was accused of rape accusations. We think that we prevent these people from constantly dominating majority views and constantly continuing to be in power. That is where structural reform happens. But the second impact we have is the impact on the rest of society. We think that this sends a message to the majority group that the society has changed, where minorities have the power to speak out against it. We think that now their mental calculus and incentive changes crucially. For example, people are more aware that they can be called out when they do things like sexual harassment or, workplace harassment against women in workplaces. That is why people are more conscious of sexual harassment in workplaces. They don't want to do that and they don't want to be called out. We change the daily behaviors that reflect subconscious decisions of these individuals, and that is crucial. We also create larger supporter bases for minorities. So instead of feeling marginalized and afraid to speak out, they can more comfortably speak out, and we create that environment. That is why our side
information.
Their burden is to prove. We think that their comparative is this. Harvey Weinstein will still be making movies. Like Alabama will have a sexist senator. We think that we don't understand why that comparative is ever better than the world we create on our sex house. Then second, why it becomes easier for minorities to reach out to legal platforms. First level of analysis. Even when legal measures existed, it was very hard for minorities to reach out to them before call-out culture has emerged because of two reasons. First, because often the legal processes were done in the perspective of majority. The majority decides what is offensive or not. That is to say, policing, trials, and etc. all happen in the perspective of the majority. But B, because trials and legal processes often require more social capital as well, like hiring powerful and expensive lawyers. The second analysis, how did call-out culture change this? This changed this because crucially, we gave minorities more agency. By calling out perpetrators, minorities gained the agency to tell society that certain things are offensive and should not be tolerated. Now it's not an individual issue, it's more of a societal issue. So for example, a group of female lawyers in the United States who fought for pro bono cases to protect victims of revenge porn for free happened because of this collective movement. Also, the Me Too movement funded people that cannot pay for lawyers and organized group of lawsuits. We think that all these show that not only do we solve structural problems, but we go ahead and enable people to reach out to legal platforms as well. We're more than proud to oppose.
The vehicle for change does not come from alienating, silencing, and excluding those that do not know why what they did was wrong. It does not come from creating mob mentalities, from having millions of people tirading upon somebody for saying a slur or for misunderstanding an issue of cultural appropriation. What the opposition has to defend is precisely this, a culture that has allowed for millions of people to dogpile on somebody who might be unaware of precisely what we are doing. We have already established that we are all for legal metrics for issues of sexual assault and official reports, such as those that happened with Harvey Weinstein. What we are not for is the public degradation and humiliation that happens every day for people that often do not know any better. That is why I am so proud to propose 3 things I will be doing for you as second speaker of the proposition. I will rebut everything the opposition has said so far, we'll go on to re-strengthen our own case, and we'll give our own third argument, that of a permanent past. First, on the rebuttal. Their first argument, that of structural empowerment, tells us about how discrimination has happened so often within our society. They tell us how it is that you've established that these views are not part of the majority, that you're giving minority people a voice, by forcing people to realize that what they did is wrong. However, we tell you that what shame and humiliation does specifically for these people is lead them towards regression, is lead them toward extremist paths, is lead them to misunderstand precisely what it is that these groups stand for. The reason why we have a rise of a far-right movement in the United States is precisely because for years people have been silenced and quiet and unable to understand precisely why it is that their views are so discarded. Only now, when they are able to speak more visibly, we see millions of people that we thought didn't exist arise precisely because the emotion, the opposition, and the culture that the opposition talks about has been promoted, precisely because these people were forced to be silent and now are unable to understand precisely why it is that their views are so disgusting. No, thank you. Beyond that, when they talk about reform, and how you establish a balance of power, we already told you in our first argument how it is that actually what you are doing is giving more empathy to the people that actually perpetrate these crimes. Because they themselves say that there's often a rule of the majority when we talk about public opinion. And public opinion, believe it or not, does not often favor minorities. What you end up having, rather, is something like a black woman calling out someone for cultural appropriation, and people, rather than understanding the nuances that come with the history of dreadlocks, simply seeing that white man as a poor white man, somebody to pity, somebody to villainize the left for. that is precisely what Callout culture has done, and that is precisely why their first argument falls. Because when a CEO is taken away for racial slurs and for remains, what we end up telling you is that A, this probably had some type of legal action in its ramifications, but B, even if it didn't, what you end up doing is giving somebody with power, like a CEO, a lack of a job. He's still probably super rich and able to do something else. The people you legitimately harm are those that have been alienated and discriminated for a large amount of time. The people who do not understand what is happening, you take away a very small amount of power to those already deeply empowered, and you degrade and push away those who are villainized and hurt. Yes.
can you give me a structural analysis on why the majority and the sexist bigots would often be the ones that the general public would defend instead of the minorities that for far too long have been oppressed within our society?
Sure, let's talk about the patriarchy and how it works, right? I'll do this really quickly. Often people don't sympathize with rape victims, with women who are speaking out, especially if we're talking about more nuanced things like a rape culture or groping a woman. Often people sympathize with these sexist bigots precisely because that is how the majority of our society structurally functions. A call-out culture that you guys propose actually gives this power to more people. Our society does not end up learning, they rather learn to A, be silent, which in the long term ends up with them being taken out of the shadows and given rise to things like white nationalist movements, or B, to simply still be sexist and to further criminalize the left, to further say that they are extremists. No thank you. On to their second argument, that in which you talk about how this actually allows for an ease of legal platforming. Judges, we believe that often companies like the ACLU are very open to talk specifically and privately with victims. We believe that this can often be done specifically as these things are becoming more open in terms of more structural discussion. Individual calling out that comes with humiliation often degrades the process of a justice system because mob mentalities do not allow for good legal structure, ladies and gentlemen. Often what this ends up doing is degrading the value of actual legal reports, of actual justice, and of what a victim actually wants in regards to punishment, because they are considered to be below that of often social media circus that has no checks and balances. Back on our re-strengthening. First of all, on our idea of cultural divide. They tell us that, oh, actually, this allows for minorities to speak out and trigger their understanding. We've already told you why majorities are not receptive to this, and how actually this creates further alienation and marginalization. Beyond this, we also told you in this argument about in-group fighting, which is very important. When you see a woman who was filing legal report for sexual assault be kicked out of a metal band, be kicked out of a minority woman community, specifically because of call-out culture, is when we tell you that larger structural issues are being ignored in favor of kicking away women, kicking away minorities, specifically because those who have less power are those most likely to be punished and reprimanded by call-out culture, is why we believe that this is so important, because you take away the prioritization of things like structural justice, of legal ramifications, of sexual assault, and rather you pinpoint a mistake a woman did years ago as something that defines her career and her life forever. On to our second argument, which they completely mischaracterized. We're not talking about people having the fear to go to trial. We're talking about how it is that actually this leads to a mob mentality that A, does not give justice to victims that don't exactly want their perpetrators to be called out. As we see with Pine Grove, it pressures victims to always speak out because it is established as the norm. And C, it actually equates different crimes at different levels because mob mentalities all lead to millions of DMs, millions of shouts, millions of careers lost. Please actually engage with our second argument rather than making something up about trials. Team Korea. With that out of the way, back to our constructive third argument, that of a permanent path, in which we tell you that this labels people down to an effect that de-promotes change. Why? Because you're tying down person to their past, on principle that we believe is wrong for somebody's identity to be tied down to their past actions, because it is constantly in flux. Judges, let me ask you, would you like to be judged for something you did 10 years ago, for words and actions that you did when you were a teenager or a preteen? We don't think so. We believe that digging up old tweets, as was done with James Gunn, who just lost a directing career by tweeting about pedophilia years ago, is not something we should perpetuate. James Gunn, who has shown to change, who has shown an ability to be more socially mobile. I'll take the point out, you have one, and I'll continue. But okay, yes.
If you're living in such a patriarchal society, why is our comparative even better for minorities?
I'll tell you why. Because what we are promoting is legitimate conversation, but is through individuals leads to actual change. But more on this in the last analysis in our third argument. As a person is simply seen as bad as they were years ago, you end up sending a message that change isn't even worth pursuing because a person will always be bad, will always be wrong, and can legitimately not change, as call-out culture is often tied down to things of decades. This makes it so that stuff like rights movements, civility movements, and progress movements are seen as completely unnecessary because you see, as a person is constantly judged for errors in the past, it isn't even worth trying to reform them, which takes away nuancy, which takes away legitimacy, people actually engaging with these people on more one-on-one conversations. When we talk about Charleston, there's a reason the most popular report involved a woman going and directly talking with white nationalists, because that is what allows for legitimate change and change of opinion. When people actually engage in conversation and actually talk, it's how we actually lead to more social movement. On the comparative, what your site has done is actually allowed for a rise to this due to secrecy and due to to the fact that people feel alienated. In our world, we see a world that could have been far more progressive because of in-group cooperation and because of out-group talking and acceptance. Judges, would you like to be judged by the ghosts of your past? I sure wouldn't. We believe you wouldn't either. Vote proposition.
When the presidential candidate of the Republican Party claims that he'll grab women by the pussy, we think that you have every right to call out on the president. We think it's legitimate for people to get angry and mad at the presidential candidate. We're more than happy to oppose. Two questions in this debate. Firstly, which side changes offensive behavior? Secondly, which side changes the structural problems in society? After dealing with these issues, I'm going to go on to the third argument on opposition and tell you why we consolidate minorities better on our side. But before that, one point of clarification. On one hand, they claim that there's going to be enough mob mentality to the extent that the very people who are doing sexist or racist comments will be condemned and won't be able to come back to society. On the other hand, they claim that these are the individuals who are going to sympathize with the person who has been blamed. Which one is it? You gotta choose one and run with it. We don't think they've been very clear with what exactly society looks like. That said, first question, which side changes offensive behavior? Government side told you that, oh, people don't change because they're misinformed and when they're humiliated, they won't change. Several levels of response. Firstly, we would say that misinformed individuals never have the incentive to change in the absence of call-out culture. We would characterize these misinformed individuals not necessarily as bad people, but people who are privileged enough to live on with their life to the extent that in the absence of any repercussion and any harm on them, they would continue to live that way. That's why their claim of discourse and discussion doesn't make sense, because it's easy for these individuals to ignore discourse, ignore discussion, especially if they are privileged individuals who aren't called out. But called out culture changes that incentive. They say that humiliation hurts you. We agree. People don't like to be humiliated. But we think that that humiliation is the very motivator that incentivizes these individuals to cut themselves out from these actions. That means that because individuals don't want to be humiliated, the very viewers who watch call-out culture and observe call-out culture are less likely to make these very racist and sexist comments in the future, because these are the very individuals who don't want to be humiliated. That means that the next director probably cannot be Harvey Weinstein, even if he is sexist, because he would be much less likely to do these kinds of behaviors that have been called out by call-out culture. You don't get that change. We would also say that the next CEO of Papa John's probably wouldn't make racist comments, even if he is a racist guy, because there's an incentive and self-protecting incentive. They make sure that they don't say these things. We think a society in which they don't say these things is an ultimately better society. Secondly, we would say that extremist individuals will exist on both sides of the house. Thirdly, we would say that these individuals being less likely to make racist and sexist comments, even if they don't fundamentally change their mind, is a good thing, because minorities don't have to hear these racist and sexist comments anymore. We think it's abhorrent that minorities oftentimes have to go through microaggression in the status quo, even if these people don't change their political ideology or change their bigotry. We would say that a world in which they don't do these behaviors and actions is a preferable world. But fourthly, even if zero change happens, we would say that call-out culture gives minorities agency. You have to be able to fight against bigotry. You have to be able to fight against the attacks that have been made on you. And oftentimes fighting against these attacks means using emotional rhetoric, means being angry about the things that have been told to you. We think this is a basic right that individuals should have, and a self-defense mechanism. We are very proud to stand by it. We don't think they defend that. Second question in this debate, which side changes structural problems? Government side says that there will be backlash because people will oftentimes feel sympathy and empathy for the perpetrator. We would say that that's not what happens in the status quo. Look at the #MeToo movement. Look at the Oscars to White movement. We would say that it wasn't the majority of society that was going against these movements. It was only a minority of society, or the majority of society actually supported these movements and were willing to support that movement. But furthermore, we would say that it's better on our side because it brings people out. It makes minorities visible. It brings the problems that they go through much more visible. That means that you can no longer say, oh, there's no discrimination against the minority, because the discrimination is very, very visible under our world. We don't understand why they changed that. Secondly, they talked about in-group fighting was just one example that they claimed to be an argument. We would say that call-out culture often incentivizes incentivizes individuals, even within minority movements, to self-correct. Because minority movements obviously aren't perfect, and they need to go through self-correcting mechanisms in order to make themselves better, in order to understand society better. We would say that that's not in-group fighting, that's a self-correcting mechanism. Finally, opposition already gave you an analysis on reform. We told you that before call-out culture existed, the police oftentimes in the past have ignored calls of sexual harassment because it was very easy for them to be dismissive about it and not care about it. The justice system has ignored them in the past. But what call-out culture did is call-out culture said that these are serious problems that our society is no longer willing to stand by. If you do these kinds of things, we will humiliate you, we will not tolerate it. That's what changed the calculus, so that the prosecution of these offenses were much more possible under our side of the house. We gave you a second argument on this. We haven't heard a response. Ultimately, we may bring down individuals or groups first, but we think that that's the platform for which structural change happens. Yes.
Why is it okay to release victims' private information without their consent?
We're not going to release victims' private information. If the victim feels that they don't want to call out on the perpetrator, then the victim shouldn't. But if the victim feels that they want to, then they should. It's very simple. Third argument on opposition, how we consolidate minority movements. Firstly, why are minorities marginalized in the absence of call-out culture? They feel like their experiences are individualized incidents rather than structural problems in the status quo. Even if they go through things like sexism, racism, society tells them that it's only a few minor perpetrators, and therefore it's hard to share these experiences because people are pressured into thinking that I may be too sensitive as a minority, and these are things we don't want people to feel. That inhibits the progress of social movements. Secondly, why does call-out culture consolidate minorities? Because call-out culture connects the dots of individual problems and sheds light on the structural problem existent in the status quo. Look at the Me Too movement. We would say that it started with experiences of individual women, but ultimately it connected the dots of these individuals and shed light on the patriarchal culture that exists in pop culture in society. Such subtle experiences become things that minorities can share amongst themselves and empathize with, become sad about, angry about, and become more emotional about. Thirdly, why is this such an important thing? We would say that minorities are marginalized and pushed into a corner in the absence of call-out culture. We want them to be open about their experiences, especially amongst themselves, because that creates power amongst themselves. Because we believe that minorities, although they may be weak when they stand as individuals, they are stronger when they are brought together and when they can put collective emphasis on the structural problems in the status quo. We can empower them much better by making sure that these people know that these are collective problems that they go through, rather than simply a problem of one individual, one perpetrator. We think it's a structural problem. We empower them to fix that. We're more than proud to oppose.
Like to live in a world where it is only Team Korea that do not judge those people that are called out, right? That those that do not sympathize with Trump when Trump says that he grabbed someone by the pussy. However, the reality is that no one is as liberal as they are. The reality is that Trump at the end did get elected, and at the end a lot of people did justify his actions and his saying by saying it was only locker room talk. At the end, we see that they are not defending what they should be defending. They are running away from the motion in the moment that they fail to actually engage with the idea that their side is for humiliation. Their side is for otherization. In my speech, I'll present to you 3 points of clash. The first one, that of empowering historically oppressed groups. The second one, that of fixing the problem. And the last one, that of the legal system. But now to my first point of clash, that of empowering historically oppressed groups, in which I will be addressing both our first arguments, because in their first argument, they come up with this really nice rhetoric about how we need a counter-narrative and how we have to empower minorities, right? However, while we do agree that we need conversation and we need counter-narratives, we do not see how the call-out culture is beneficial for this. We've already constantly explained to you why this is how humiliating others only antagonizes the ones that are calling them out. But furthermore, we tell you in our first argument the idea of this need of conversation. And the problem with the call-out culture is that when you're calling out, when you're humiliating others, you're not seeing yourself as equals. And for conversation and for progress to happen, you have to be able to see not the other as the antagonist, but rather as the equal. They tell us that humiliation incentivizes people to change and to further themselves apart from the narrative they are protecting. However, judges, would you really want to change because someone humiliated you, right? What we tell you is that people are more willing to cooperate and to change when they are explained what they are doing wrong, not when they are painted as the antagonist, not when they are humiliated. When we tell you that when emotions are underplaced, when they're telling you you're the absolute wrong, then it's very hard for you to actually comply. It is very hard for you to be incentivized to change. We tell you that doesn't happen with the call-out culture. Furthermore, let's talk about what they haven't addressed in our first argument, right? Because in our first argument, we talked to you about a lot of things. First of all, how the radicals the ones that are more moderate will only radicalize. Because they tell us racism will exist in both sides. What we tell you is that we agree. Those that are racist will continue to be racist. The problem is with those that are moderates, right? And the ones that have the choice to either go with the ones that are humiliating people and to be the ones that set that narrative, or the ones who feel like the victims. When you have a side that is humiliating, then inevitably they'll see the others as the victims. The ones that are the perpetuators will now be the ones people feel empathetic to. We tell you that when they talk about how, well, yeah, we are more sympathetic to the ones that come with the Me Too movement. We tell you that is not necessarily the case. That might be the case for liberal people. We don't see this happening for the people that are moderates, for the people that are trying to define themselves as maybe liberal or feminist, but now because someone is painting a feminist as a radical that humiliates people, that don't give others a chance, then they won't want to assimilate that label. But furthermore, they tell us, well, now society knows that things are bad. Now they know that raping is bad. We tell you that people already know this. We tell you that the problem is that when you have a radical movement, this gets blurry, right? It's not clear who's the bad guy and who is the victim, right? And that is why we need this justice system that is not as biased as theirs. But now to my second point of clash, that of fixing the problem addressing both our third arguments. Let me just remark the idea that up until now, our third argument remains untouched. And this is extremely important, judges. Why? Because here's where we tell you that in the moment where you start judging people because of mistakes that they've made in the past, where you continue to punish them in the future independently of how they changed or how they progressed. Here's where we talk about James Gunn, the person that used to make jokes about inappropriate things, used to make offensive remarks, but now has changed and now is being punished because their tweets got to light again. We tell you that in that point they have to explain to us what is even the point of the movements that seek for equal rights? What is the point of the movements that seek change if at the end they will always, because of the call-out culture, go back to the history, go back to how people used to be? In the moment you send this message, you're sending the message that people won't change, and then what is the point? They failed to answer to that. We think the third opposition should answer to that, although probably it's already too late. But furthermore, let's talk about their third argument, which is very similar to their first. They basically tell us minorities will be empowered because, well, they're strong together. We tell you none of this is exclusive to the call-out culture, right? When they talk about the call-out culture, they have to tell us why the humiliation factor is so important for them to stand together, right? Because when we talk about how you still have newspapers, you still have justice system, you still have other means that do not require the antagonization of a group to make these people be more equal, to empower them, we still don't see how this is exclusive to their side. But furthermore, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Let's see that they are already empowered. Let's assume that. What we see is that the call-out culture has been happening for a long time now. And we still see that these historically oppressed groups continue to be oppressed. we still don't see a real big change about how they were treated before as to how they are treated now. Yes.
Society is changing in the sense that individuals see that other people are humiliated and cut down from these actions. Why do you claim that society is not changing?
I understand your point, sir. Ma'am. However, when we see that people are humiliated, we really do not see how they are changing. We see that when they're humiliated, they are not normally radicalized, and they are normally more and more susceptible to go to far-right movements. But now onto my last point of clash, the legal system, in which I want to address my second argument, which was quite mischaracterized, right? Because when we talk about victims, we talk about people that didn't decide to call out, but rather other people took their stories, told it to the world, and decided to expose them to everyone when they didn't want that to happen. They say they are against that, but at the end, call-out culture represents that. Second of all, we tell you that the offenders are normally punished more than they would be under a clear justice system. They still have to answer to that, dropped again on their side. Lastly, on their second argument, we see that it's the same. We tell you that people trivialize mistakes, and at the end, the legal system fails. It is the legitimized, stands at the side that helps historically oppressed groups, not with opposition.
I think it's very unfair that just because government side is unable to distinguish what our first and third arguments are, that they misrepresent it and combine it and engage in as a whole is not going to win them the debate. So what I'm going to do in my clashes are simple. Firstly, I'm going to explain, can we change the structural imbalances that exist with this kind of call-out structure? And secondly, whether social backlash, which is technically their only harm that they talked about within their entire case, can that overcome the minority empowerment that we so forth set as a principle from our side? But before I move on, let it be clear on the third argument that we did respond to, but they continued to lack on an engagement as a response. They said, and so I'll further expand on this, they talked about if you make a past mistake, then you should not be punished for it in the present. We have multiple levels of response to this. That's like firstly saying that just because you killed someone 10 years ago, that the impacts of your sexual abuse, the impacts of the racism will be diminished that over time. We think that's not the case, and we are more than likely and happy to stand for your past mistakes as a result that you still have to pay the retribution for, because these people who are the victims have always been the ones who have been hurt. We think that's the principle that we stand on. It is not up to the person who perpetrates the crime that decides how impactful it is. It is always the person who receives and who are the victims of such crime in the first place. First clash, can we change the structural imbalance that exists within the society? Because let it be clear that this debate isn't so black and white in which it is obvious on something is a crime and something is not. Because on side opposition, the very kind of things we want to stop are things that society deems is okay, even though for the person who receives it is often not. Things like microaggression, things like racial slurs. These are the kind of things that we want to structurally change, which is why we completely denied from the leader of opposition that these legal systems will be a possible system in order to change this kind of mechanism in the first place. We told you the flaws of the legal system, which is exactly the reason why we need the people to call out the kind of misdemeanors in the first place. But anyways, the first analysis is understanding and creating discussion and discourse among society. Because notice that the entire proposition case was if you humiliate them, you're going to have less discussion. And that was their single line of response that continued on from the Prime Minister to their government without any change. We continue to ask for, why humiliation would change things? Let me give you on a direct clash. Firstly, we told you from opposition side that the fact that you call out someone is in and of itself going to tell other people who have similar ideas to the perpetrator that no, this is wrong. For instance, the idea of racial slurs, the idea of microaggression to females, is oftentimes in the privileged people's point of view who have never been discriminated, fail to understand that this is right or wrong. They conceded it in their Prime Minister as well. They said that not all people are evil and people just simply lack the understanding. Then we think according to the same context that is from proposition and opposition, the job of our society is to inform them. And sure, we would want to live in a scenario where we don't have to humiliate them,
but we gave structural analysis from our leader of opposition on why purely trying to inform them without causing any deterrence or without having any repercussions is systematically unable to work in the status quo. That's the reason why we said that we have to have these people called out in order for other people to recognize the seriousness and deter them from the future processes of making such mistakes in the first place. Secondly,
Sir.
agency. We told you the idea that minorities should be able to defend themselves. This is assuming our worst case scenario, that this does not cause structural changes or reforms in the first place. But even under this case, we think it's very imperative to know that agency for the minorities to have a self-mechanism to defend themselves and to have a minority that backs them up is ultimately the kind of emphasis that we want to have from our side of the House. That was exactly what our second speaker's third argument was about the minorities coming together and defending each other, because ultimately these are the kind of impacts that we see. That even though under the worst case scenario that structural changes don't exist, we have each other to back each other up for principal goals. I'm going to later establish that on my second class as well, but we think fundamentally it was a lack of analysis on how minorities can empower each other as a whole. Then thirdly, the impacts that we bring from the practical matters, from the principles we defend. We told you that we change the daily mindsets of these kind of people, and we show as a prerequisite that your actions are not okay. In our scenario, in our society, we don't have the Papa John's CEO become a racist person. We celebrate the fact that he is no longer able to come back to his own company that he created. We have when it disincentivize people like Harvey Weinstein to actually cause sexual abuse, because these are the kind of repercussions that they understand. But secondly, we also talked about the idea of a supporter base for minorities in which there was a continuous lack of engagements. But thirdly, under their best case scenario, that this would cause racist people to continue, we think racist people will exist on both sides of the House in the first place. The fact that you enact or don't enact a culture isn't going to change the racist people's personalities. But at least on our side of the House, we tell the racist people, no, that's not okay. No, we're not going to tolerate as a society that you are going to be doing these. I'll take you in a moment. That's exactly the reason why we think, even though racist people are equal to likely, which we don't even concede, we think they're likely to decrease in number on our side, we at least disincentivize them from acting up to the minorities in the first place. Yes?
If people are shamed for saying the N-word, will people understand what is racism and why is it wrong, or simply that they should not say that word?
Yes, if I was shamed by my classmates for saying the N-word, then I'll recognize, oh, that's not something I should do, and then I won't do it in the future in the first place. Humiliation is what we use in order to try to tell people that no, it's not okay. I don't understand how their response or their analysis on not humiliating them, but trying to say, hey dude, don't say the N-word because it's kind of bad without humiliating them, is going to make any more positive change in comparison to our society. But secondly, on the social backlash that they continue to analyze in this case. We think firstly, as our second speaker has talked about, which lacked an engagement from their second to third, is the fact that this is fundamentally what doesn't happen in the status quo. Because according to their context, people are not racist, but people just fail to understand what is right and what is wrong. Then under this context, we think social backlash is less likely to occur under our side of the House. Because fundamentally what happens is people recognize what is wrong, and so they won't side with the minority bigots as they have characterized, but after people understand, they would side with those who have been constantly perpetrated, constantly been a victim for the past century or so. But secondly, we think it's also very patronizing for them to say that these minorities should not have a right to say what they want, should not have a right to feel victimized just because social backlash exists in the first place. Because notice, this debate isn't about how the people who become humiliated feel better. This debate is about whether the minorities can best empower their own personal views and best feel better about themselves, which we gave you from the entire opposition bench, the structural analysis on why minorities will feel better on their side of the House. But third, let's assume the best case scenario. We'll bite the bullet and say social backlash exists, we don't care. Because this is a process that we as side opposition are willing to endure for a greater future, for a future that has changed, for a future where the minority is not targeted, where a minority is not victimized. We are more than proud to oppose this motion.
I wish the world was perfect. I wish I lived in a world where discourse and discussion was enough to solve all of the racism and sexism in the status quo. But unfortunately, we don't live in that world. Unfortunately, although we may be able to solve our problems through debate, other parts of society, that's not necessarily true. We would say that society is imperfect, and given the imperfection, we have to oftentimes use other methods. Two questions in this debate. Firstly, which side changes offensive behavior? Secondly, which side changes the structural problem? So first, which side changes offensive behavior? I think by this point in the debate, we both agree that the individuals we want to target are not necessarily the extremist evil individuals, but misinformed individuals. We already characterize these individuals as people who aren't necessarily evil or bad, but who don't have much incentive to change in the status quo. We already brought you that analysis. Therefore, we told you that they don't listen to things like discussions or discourse because it doesn't have an impact on their life. Because they have no incentive to change in the absence of actual repercussions. Because let's face it, people are selfish, and if you are a privileged individual, you are much less likely to adapt to society that is progressing to embrace the minority. We already told you from the leader of opposition that particularly for these individuals, we send a message that racism, sexism, regardless of how explicit or subtle it is intolerable and behavior that the society is not willing to stand by. We told you that humiliation is a mechanism through which we tell them that you cannot continue with this behavior. We told you that therefore these individuals are going to be much more willing to make changes. They said, oh, even if you change your behavior and even if you change the way you speak, your mind's not going to change, so it's a problem. But it has to be about a comparative in this debate. Ultimately, it's going to be very hard to change the minds of these individuals. Therefore, we would rather live in a world in which the minority doesn't have to hear the very racist and sexist comments that these individuals have to offer. This is exactly what we told you throughout our bench. We haven't heard a response to that. But finally, even in the worst case, we told you that these individuals should be able to have self-defense. We would say that calling out is a measure of self-defense. We haven't got an engagement to this either. Ultimately, we are the side that told you not only just why we change individual behavior better, we also told you that even if we don't do that, why we stand for call-out culture. We don't think they were very comparative here. Second clash in this debate. Which side changes the structural problem? Firstly, they gave you the idea of backlash. We already told you that this is at tension with their claim about mob mentality, because you can't have both societies. Secondly, we told you that this is less likely to happen and not necessarily happen all the time. We gave you the example, and therefore we don't think that. Therefore, we think they were simply being assertive when they say, "Oh, there's just going to be more backlash." But thirdly, we told you that even if it happened, it's a process for change. Just because there's going to be backlash doesn't mean the rights of minorities always has to be ignored. We would say that oftentimes these minorities are the most vulnerable individuals, and therefore we're willing to pay a cost if we are able to empower them better and make their lives better. Finally, we told you about the idea of reform in our second argument. We told you that oftentimes structural reform is impossible because of the fact that oftentimes minorities aren't necessarily listened to. We create an incentive for the police to listen to minorities because if they don't listen, oftentimes they will be called out on. We told you that we create an incentive for the justice system to listen to these minorities. All of these have been unresponded to. Ultimately, we stand for a society where the society is best capable of protecting the most vulnerable individuals. We're more than proud to oppose.
Happened through years of silencing and of misinformation not being addressed. It was one where people were told they could not say the N-word, where they could not be proud of their white heritage or have white pride without ever being told why. This lack of why is precisely what call-out culture propagates. It is precisely why we regret it, because we regret a culture that has silenced those that are misinformed, giving them a rise to extremism, giving them a rise to the most dangerous areas in our society. Two questions that make it clear why the proposition has won this debate. First of all, is humiliation effective? And second of all, should mistakes be permanent? Let's begin with our first question. Is humiliation effective? We told you in our first argument that somebody does not learn by being silent, by being cast away, by being put in a cage, and by being told that their views do not matter, and that what they believe does not matter, by being dogpiled on by millions. Rather, we told you that by conversing and having effective discourse, we're able to reach better conclusions. To this, they simply say that minorities are empowered and that this matters above all. However, to this we told you in our second argument that actually, in a large amount of cases, victims aren't empowered because their own perpetrators are called out without their consent, something they completely decide to not engage with, and beyond that, we simply see the fact that this isn't true. When someone like Donald Trump is elected, and when we see the rise of the far right happen, we see it happen explicitly because people are misinformed and were never able to be engaged with and conversed with in a way that is legitimate. If this was to happen, if this could have happened in our past, we would have had a society that is more progressive and more understanding. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, none of it came by shutting people down, but by explaining their discourse, explaining why it is that these issues are so important. Beyond that, we told you how this actually leads to problems within in-groups, how this type of humiliation actually stops more legitimate political processes because in the left, in liberal areas, people focus on the mitigations and the problems that their own liberals had, rather than focusing on larger structural problems. To this, they self-improvement is important. We agree, but we believe it is more important to tackle structural issues than to highlight these things, which happens often in call-out culture in group areas. This leads to more division, more misinformation, and it also leads, directly tackling this second argument, to a devaluation of justice, because humiliation is held above all, different crimes are put at the same level, and legitimate punishments are never reached. Everything is treated the same, and nobody understands precisely why it is, because as our first speaker told you, social media has no checks and no balances. But now, on to our second question. Should mistakes be permanent? Here we saw a real lack of engagement to the deep areas of our third substantive, in which we told you that identifying somebody by a couple of tweets they made in the past about pedophilia and saying that because of that they shouldn't be able to direct a movie is on principle wrong. By this principle alone, we should win this debate, because judges, I've already asked you, would you like to be defined by words, by phrases, by actions that you committed a decade ago? We believe not, and we believe that is precisely what call-out culture has propagated with people like James Gunn, with people whose careers were ruined by front metal bands who were able to be kicked away by these communities because of mistakes they did in high school. By this alone, we believe we should win, but beyond that, they tell you that, oh no, actually it's great for people to be punished for saying a couple of slurs in high school without ever telling us explicitly why, because in the vast majority of cases, that is precisely what is happening. Small mistakes are being blown up decades later and hurting the careers of people who might now actually stand with those that seek for social justice. Beyond that, we told you how this, in the long term, puts change as something unnecessary. We told you how it is, the moment that you define a person as permanently stuck in their past, social progress for movements and social movements to change people's minds and to promote conversations which we want on our side are no longer valued, because there's no point in changing a person's mind if their mistakes are what defines them. There is no point in me trying to become a better person if nobody cares, if it will still be called out by mistakes I propagated years ago. Beyond this makes it for them more likely to be silent and more propagation. Vote for the side of change, vote for the side of conversation, vote for the side of the problem.